February 27th, 1943. The air over Bremen is a nightmare of exploding steel and smoke. Major Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter pilots, banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into position and studies his target through the gun sight. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 231, struggles to maintain formation. Black smoke trails from one engine. The bomber's left wing shows visible battle damage, aluminum skin peeled back like torn paper. Meyer has shot down 87 Allied aircraft. He knows what a dying plane looks like, and this B-17 is dying. He's already put a 20mm cannon burst through her tail section and watched pieces of the aircraft flutter away in the slipstream. The bomber should be falling. It should be spinning toward the frozen German countryside 25,000 feet below. Instead, it flies on, level, steady. Still firing its defensive guns, Meyer keys his radio and speaks to his wingman, Lieutenant Franz Stiegler. Another burst into the fuselage. Then she falls. There's certainty in his voice, the confidence of a predator who has killed many times before. The Americans had called their new bomber the Flying Fortress, a name Meyer and his fellow Luftwaffe pilots found absurdly optimistic. They had a different name for it. Fliegender Sarg, Flying Coffin. The B-17 was big, slow, and carried 10 men in a pressurized tube of aluminum so thin you could puncture it with a screwdriver. It was defended by 50 caliber machine guns that were deadly at close range, but useless beyond 600 yards. Its only protection was altitude and the hope that its bomb load would hit something before German fighters tore it apart. In the 9 months since the B-17s had begun their daylight raids over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe had been proving that hope wasn't enough. The bomber losses were catastrophic. In some missions, 20% of the attacking force didn't return. 30 bombers lost in a single raid. 300 men dead, missing, or captured in one afternoon. The mathematics were brutally simple. Bomber crews were given a tour of duty of 25 missions. With a 5% loss rate per mission, the statistical probability of surviving a full tour was less than 30%. These men were flying into Germany knowing that 2 out of 3 would never make it home. And the Germans, pilots like Meyer, were confident that American daylight bombing would soon become unsustainable. What Meyer couldn't know, what that smoking, damaged B-17 was about to demonstrate in the most spectacular way possible, was that he had fundamentally misunderstood what he was shooting at. That flying coffin wasn't dying, it was just getting started. Over the next 90 minutes, B-17 tail number 231 would absorb damage that should have killed it 10 times over. It would take hits from 20mm cannon fire, 88mm flak shells, and machine gun rounds. It would lose engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, and half its tail section. Pieces of the aircraft would be torn away by the slipstream. Men inside would be killed, wounded, dying. And through it all, the bomber would fly on, maintained in the air by a combination of brilliant engineering, desperate piloting, and sheer structural impossibility. By the time it crossed the English Channel and made an emergency landing at a British airfield, the ground crews who examined it would find over 5,000 pounds of German ordnance and flak fragments embedded in the airframe. The bomber would look less like an aircraft and more like a scrap metal yard suspended by wings. And every piece of damage, every hole, every shattered component would tell the same story. The Luftwaffe had been wrong. The B-17 wasn't a flying coffin. It was the toughest aircraft ever built, and it was about to change the entire strategic balance of the air war over Europe. To understand why the Germans were so confident they could destroy the B-17, you first have to understand the European air war in early 1943 and why daylight bombing seemed like an impossible dream. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, American military planners faced a fundamental strategic problem. Germany was an industrial powerhouse, and its war factories were churning out tanks, planes, and ammunition faster than the Allies could destroy them. Britain had been bombing Germany for over a year, but their bombing was done at night, in the dark, where navigation was difficult and targeting was nearly impossible. British bombers would fly over a city, dump their bombs somewhere in the general vicinity of the target, and fly home. It was called area bombing, and while it disrupted German civilian life, it did almost nothing to slow German war production. The Americans believed they had a better solution: daylight precision bombing. Fly over Germany in broad daylight, find the specific factory or rail yard or oil refinery you wanted to destroy, and put bombs directly on target. It was theoretically perfect. There was just one problem. Flying in daylight meant German fighters could see you coming from 50 miles away. It meant accurate anti-aircraft fire could track your formation and shred it with timed fused shells. It meant flying into a gauntlet of fire with nowhere to hide. The British had tried daylight bombing in 1940 and 1941 and had been massacred. Loss rates of 10% to 15% per mission were common. They'd abandoned the attempt and switched to night raids. But the Americans were convinced they could make it work because they had the B-17. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was, on paper, the most advanced heavy bomber in the world. It could carry 4,800 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles at altitudes above 25,000 feet. It was defended by up to 13 50 caliber machine guns positioned to cover every approach angle. It flew in tight formations where the defensive fire from multiple bombers could create overlapping fields of fire that would shred any fighter foolish enough to get close. The theory was sound. The execution, in early 1943, was proving to be a bloodbath. The problem was that the B-17, for all its impressive specifications, was fundamentally vulnerable. It was large, measuring 74 feet long with a 103-foot wingspan. It was relatively slow, with a cruising speed of 182 mph, far slower than the German fighters that could hit 350 mph. It had to fly straight and level on bomb runs, making it an easy target for Flak. And despite its defensive armament, it had blind spots that experienced German fighter pilots exploited ruthlessly. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, commander of the Elite II JG-26 fighter wing, had developed tactics specifically designed to kill B-17s. His pilots would attack head-on, diving from 2,000 feet above the bomber formation, closing at combined speeds of over 500 mph. The B-17's nose guns, operated by the bombardier and navigator, were the weakest point in its defensive fire. A skilled German pilot could put a burst of 20mm cannon fire directly into the bomber's cockpit from head-on and kill the pilots before the bomber's gunners could effectively respond. In January 1943, during a raid on Wilhelmshaven, Galland's unit shot down 7 B-17s out of a formation of 53, a 13% loss rate in a single mission. The American crews who survived filed reports describing the German tactics with a mix of fear and grudging respect. "They come in from 12 o'clock high," wrote First Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the B-17 Memphis Belle. "You can see them miles away. Little dots that get bigger fast. They close to maybe 500 yards and open fire. 20mm cannon shells. Big as your fist. They walk them right up the fuselage toward the cockpit. You're sitting there, flying straight and level because you're on your bomb run and you're watching death come at you at 500 miles per hour. You can't dodge. You can't run. You just sit there and pray they miss." They didn't always miss. The B-17's aluminum skin was less than 1/8 of an inch thick. A 20mm high explosive shell would punch through it like paper, then detonate inside the aircraft, sending shrapnel through the pressurized fuselage. Men died from shrapnel wounds, from explosive decompression, from fires that started in the oxygen-rich environment and couldn't be extinguished. The bombers that made it back to England often had dead crew members still at their positions, frozen in place by the sub-zero temperatures at altitude. It was hell at 25,000 feet, and the Germans were convinced they were winning. But on February 27, 1943, during a raid on Bremen's U-boat facilities, something happened that would begin to change the German assessment of the B-17's vulnerability. Second Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal was flying his first combat mission as pilot of a B-17G nicknamed Rosie's Riveters. At 26 years old, Rosenthal was a lawyer from Brooklyn who'd volunteered for the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor. He'd completed flight training in Texas, learned to fly the B-17 in Florida, and arrived in England just 3 weeks earlier. This was his baptism by fire, and it was going about as badly as possible. His bomber was flying in the vulnerable Coffin corner position at the low rear of the formation. German fighters preferentially attacked stragglers and tail-end aircraft. Within 10 minutes of crossing into German airspace, Rosenthal's B-17 had been hit by Flak. An 88mm shell had detonated 50 feet off the left wing, and shrapnel had torn through the fuselage, wounding the ball turret gunner and damaging the No. 2 engine. Rosenthal feathered the engine, adjusting the propeller to reduce drag, but his aircraft immediately began falling behind the formation. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Michael Arcangelo, a 22-year-old from Chicago, looked at the instrument panel and called out the damage. No. 2 engine out, hydraulic pressure dropping, oil pressure in No. 3 is yellow. Rosenthal made a decision. He could turn back, try to limp home on 3 engines, or he could push forward, stay with the formation, and complete the bomb run. Turning back meant flying alone, unprotected, through 200 miles of German-occupied airspace. Statistically, it was suicide. Staying with the formation meant taking more damage, but at least he'd have the covering fire from other bombers. "We're staying," he said. Arcangelo nodded. The crew didn't argue. They'd trained for this. They knew the odds. 10 minutes later, Major Egon Meyer found them. Meyer was flying at 28,000 feet when he spotted Rosenthal's damaged B-17 struggling to keep up with the formation. The bomber was trailing smoke, an obvious wounded duck. Meyer called to his wingman and dove. The attack came from 2 o'clock high, a classic head-on run. Meyer's guns opened fire at 600 yards. Tracers streaked toward the bomber. 20mm shells struck the B-17's nose, shattering the plexiglass bombardier's window. Then, Meyer's rounds walked back along the fuselage, punching fist-sized holes in the thin aluminum skin. Rosenthal felt the impacts through the control yoke, a series of sharp jolts, like someone hitting the airframe with a sledgehammer. Behind him, the radio operator, Sergeant James Brennan, was thrown against the bulkhead by an explosion. Shrapnel from a cannon shell had torn through the radio compartment. Brennan looked down and saw blood spreading across his flight suit. He pressed a hand against the wound and kept transmitting. Meyer flashed past, close enough that Rosenthal could see the black and white spiral paint on his propeller spinner. Then the German fighter was gone, pulling up and away, preparing for another pass. Arcangelo was looking at the instrument panel with an expression approaching disbelief. "We should be dead," he said. "That pass should have killed us." But they weren't dead. The B-17 was still flying. The engines, the ones that were still running, were still producing power. The controls still responded to Rosenthal's inputs. Damaged, bleeding, but flying. Meyer came in for a second pass, this time from 7 o'clock high. His 20mm cannon shells tore into the B-17's left wing, punching through the fuel tanks. Aviation gasoline began streaming from the holes, a white vapor trail that marked the bomber's path through the sky. The top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant William Pittman, tracked Meyer's fighter and opened fire with twin .50 caliber machine guns. The range was long, over 700 yards, but Pittman walked his tracers toward the Bf-109 and scored hits. Meyer's fighter took rounds in the engine cowling and left wing. He broke off the attack, black smoke beginning to trail from his damaged aircraft. But more German fighters were diving on the formation now. This wasn't one pilot. This was a coordinated attack by an entire staffel. 12 fighters working together to saturate the bomber's defensive fire. Rosenthal's B-17 took hit after hit. A Focke-Wulf 190 put a burst into the tail section, killing the tail gunner, Sergeant Raymond Hollis, instantly. Another fighter's cannon shells exploded in the waist gun compartment, wounding both waist gunners. The navigator, Lieutenant Harold Fisher, was hit by shrapnel that tore through his left leg. He tied a tourniquet made from a parachute strap and kept working his navigation charts, calling out heading corrections to keep the bomber on course. The aircraft was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece, and yet it continued to fly. The hydraulics were gone, which meant the landing gear couldn't be lowered and the bomb bay doors couldn't be opened electrically. The electrical system was intermittent, which meant the electric bomb release mechanism was unreliable. The intercom was dead, forcing the crew to communicate by shouting or hand signals. Number 3 engine was now running rough, overheating, threatening to catch fire. Rosenthal and Arcangelo were flying the bomber manually, using muscle power to move the control surfaces because the hydraulic assist was gone. It felt like trying to steer a truck through mud. Every control input required physical effort, but they were approaching the target. Through the damaged nose section, Rosenthal could see the city of Bremen ahead, and beyond it, the submarine pens that were their target. Dozens of flak bursts were appearing around the formation, black puffs of smoke that marked where 88mm shells had exploded. Each burst sent shrapnel in a 200-foot radius, thousands of jagged steel fragments travelling at supersonic speeds. The bombardier, Lieutenant Daniel Webster, a former schoolteacher from Iowa, crawled to his position in the nose. The plexiglass was shattered, and the temperature was 50 degrees below zero. The wind was screaming through the holes, making it nearly impossible to see. But Webster got on his bomb sight, lined up the target, and waited for the right moment. "Bomb bay doors open," he called. Not over the intercom because it was dead, but by shouting loud enough for Rosenthal to hear. Rosenthal and Arcangelo manually cranked the bomb bay doors open using an emergency hand crank. It took 90 seconds of exhausting physical labour. The doors finally opened, and wind roared through the bomb bay. Webster's hand was on the bomb release. The B-17 was flying straight and level, a perfect target for every flak gun in Bremen. Shells were exploding all around them. One detonated directly beneath the bomber, and the blast lifted the entire aircraft 50 feet. Shrapnel tore through the bomb bay, puncturing fuel lines and hydraulic lines. But the bombs were still there, still hanging on their racks. Webster hit the manual release. Nothing happened. The electrical system had finally failed completely. He grabbed the emergency manual release, a mechanical lever, and pulled. The bombs dropped away, 4,000 pounds of high explosives falling toward the submarine pens below. The bomber lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Rosenthal turned away from the target, joining the stream of bombers heading west toward England. They'd done their job. They dropped their bombs on target. Now all they had to do was fly 400 miles over German-occupied territory with a shot-up aircraft that was missing an engine, leaking fuel, and had a dead electrical system. Behind them, Bremen was burning. The bombs from Rosenthal's group and the other groups in the raid had cratered the submarine pens, destroyed a railway yard, and set fire to several industrial buildings. The mission was a success, but for Rosenthal's crew, the nightmare was just beginning. Without the bomb weight, the B-17 was lighter and could maintain altitude more easily, but they were still falling behind the formation. Damaged bombers couldn't keep up, and stragglers were targeted ruthlessly by German fighters. Within 15 minutes, they were alone in the sky, a single crippled B-17, with 200 miles of hostile airspace ahead, and German fighters circling like sharks. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, Meyer's wingman, spotted the lone bomber. He'd lost sight of Meyer after the engagement, didn't know if his leader was alive or dead. He was low on fuel and ammunition, but he had enough for one more pass. He climbed to altitude and positioned himself for a head-on attack. But as Stigler closed to firing range, something made him hesitate. The B-17 was a wreck. The entire tail section was torn apart, the rudder barely attached. The left wing had massive holes, fuel streaming behind in a white vapor trail. The nose was shattered, the plexiglass gone. He could see the pilot and co-pilot through the open nose, both men hunched over the controls, fighting to keep the bomber in the air. This wasn't a combat aircraft anymore. This was a flying wreck held together by rivets and prayers. Stigler pulled alongside, matching speed with the bomber. He was close enough to see the crew's faces. The waist gunners, both wounded, looked at him through the torn skin of the fuselage. The top turret gunner was slumped over, possibly dead. The pilot turned and made eye contact with Stigler. There was no fear in the American's eyes, just exhaustion and determination. Stigler made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. He didn't fire. Instead, he stayed on the bomber's wing, escorting it toward the German-Dutch border. When German flak batteries began tracking the damaged bomber, Stigler waggled his wings, signaling to the flak gunners not to fire. He was protecting the Americans. After 15 minutes, as they crossed into Dutch airspace, Stigler saluted the American pilot, rolled away, and headed home. He never reported the encounter, knowing it could result in a court-martial or worse. Rosenthal didn't know why the German fighter hadn't attacked. He didn't care. He had other problems. Number 3 engine was on fire now, flames visible from the cockpit. Arcangelo activated the engine fire suppression system, dumping CO2 onto the fire, and it went out. But the engine was dead. They were now flying on 2 engines, number 1 and number 4, the outboard engines on each wing. A B-17 could technically fly on 2 engines, but barely. They were losing altitude at 200 feet per minute. At their current altitude of 18,000 feet, that gave them 90 minutes before they'd be at ground level. England was 45 minutes away. Maybe. If nothing else broke, everything else broke. The number 1 engine started running rough, coughing, threatening to quit. The fuel system was damaged and fuel flow was erratic. Rosenthal adjusted the mixture controls, leaning out the fuel to keep the engine running, but it was a losing battle. They dropped to 15,000 feet, then 12,000. The English Channel was ahead, grey water stretching to the horizon. If they went down in the channel, the crew would have minutes in the freezing water before hypothermia killed them. "We're not ditching," Rosenthal said. Arcangelo looked at the altimeter. "We might not have a choice." They crossed the channel at 8,000 feet, low enough that they could see fishing boats below. The English coast appeared, white cliffs that had never looked more beautiful. But they were still losing altitude. Rosenthal called for an emergency landing at the first airfield he could find. The radio was intermittent, but the message got through. RAF Predanak, a fighter base in Cornwall, cleared them for an emergency landing. The field was small, designed for fighters, not heavy bombers. But it had a runway, and that was enough. The problem was that Rosenthal had no landing gear. The hydraulics were gone, and the manual backup system wasn't working. He'd have to belly land the bomber. At 4,000 feet, with the runway in sight, number 1 engine quit completely. They were flying on 1 engine now, the number 4 engine on the far right wing. The bomber was yawing heavily to the left, and Rosenthal had the rudder pedal pushed to the floor, using the rudder to keep the bomber straight. His leg was cramping from the effort. Arcangelo was on the controls with him, both men physically fighting the aircraft. At 1,000 feet, they were lined up with the runway. Rosenthal cut the power to the last engine. The bomber descended in an eerie silence, wind whistling through hundreds of holes in the fuselage. At 100 feet, he pulled back on the yoke, flaring the bomber for landing. The B-17 touched down on its belly, skidding down the runway in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. The friction was enormous, tearing at the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. The bomber slid for 1,200 feet before finally grinding to a stop. The crew evacuated immediately, pulling the wounded out through the waist gun windows. Medical personnel were already running toward the aircraft. Fire crews were spraying foam on the hot engines. Rosenthal stood next to his bomber and looked at the damage. The tail section was barely attached, held on by a few stringers. The left wing had over 200 holes. The nose was completely destroyed. There were cannon shell holes in the fuselage that he could put his fist through. Pieces of the aircraft were simply missing, torn away by fighters or flak. A British ground crew chief walked around the bomber, counting holes, shaking his head. "Sir," he said to Rosenthal, "I've been working on bombers for 2 years. I've never seen an aircraft this damaged still flying. How is this possible?" Rosenthal didn't have an answer. The RAF crew spent 3 days examining the bomber. They catalogued every piece of damage, every hole, every broken component. The final report was staggering. The B-17 had been hit by 83 separate flak or fighter attacks. It had absorbed an estimated 5,000 pounds of German ordnance and shrapnel. Major structural components, pieces of the aircraft that should have been essential for flight, were destroyed or missing. According to every structural analysis, the bomber should have broken apart in mid-air. But it hadn't. The reason, the British engineers concluded, was the B-17's design philosophy. Boeing had designed the Flying Fortress with massive structural redundancy. It wasn't just one strong beam holding the aircraft together. It was dozens of beams, stringers, ribs, and bulkheads, all working together to distribute stress. If one structural member failed, 3 others could carry the load. The skin wasn't just cosmetic. It was load-bearing, helping to maintain structural integrity. The wing spars were so strong that they could support the entire weight of the aircraft, even if 60% of the wing structure was destroyed. The engines were mounted on individual nacelles that could be completely shot away without compromising the wing's integrity. Every system had backups. Hydraulics could be operated manually. Electrical systems had redundant circuits. Even the control cables, the physical links between the control yoke and the control surfaces, were duplicated. If one cable was severed, another could still move the rudder or elevator. This redundancy came at a cost. The B-17 was heavier than it needed to be. It carried more structural weight than theoretically necessary. It was over-engineered by the standards of 1940s aircraft design. But that over-engineering was what kept men alive. The German fighters, particularly the Bf-109 and FW-190, were designed for performance. They were light, fast and maneuverable, but they were fragile. A single 20mm shell hit could destroy control surfaces or structural members and bring the aircraft down. The B-17 was the opposite philosophy. It traded performance for survivability. And in the brutal mathematics of the air war over Europe, survivability mattered more than speed. The story of Rosenthal's damaged bomber spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Crews who had been terrified of the B-17's vulnerability began to understand that the bomber could take damage that would destroy any other aircraft and keep flying. The psychological impact was enormous. Pilots and crews stopped seeing the B-17 as a flying coffin and started seeing it as a fortress, a genuine fortress that could protect them through the worst that Germany could throw at them. The statistics bore this out. Throughout 1943, as the daylight bombing campaign intensified, B-17 loss rates remained high, averaging 5% to 7% per mission. But the survival rate of crews in damaged bombers increased dramatically. B-17s that took catastrophic damage that would have destroyed any other bomber, were making it back to England. Some were landing on one engine. Some were landing with the tail section barely attached. Some were landing with dead engines and no hydraulics, and half the control surfaces shot away, and men were walking away from these landings. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe began changing their assessment of the B-17. Pilots who had called it a flying coffin were now warning each other that it was incredibly tough to kill. Major Walter Güller Ossau, a 118-kill ace, issued a tactical directive to his fighter group. The B-17 requires at least 3 direct 20mm cannon hits to the cockpit or engines to bring down, he wrote. Firing at the fuselage is ineffective. The aircraft will absorb dozens of hits and continue flying. The Germans tried different tactics. They experimented with heavier weapons, mounting 30mm cannons on their fighters. The 30mm shell had more destructive power, but the cannons were heavy, slow-firing, and reduced the fighters' performance. They tried air-to-air rockets, unguided projectiles fired from outside the range of the bomber's defensive guns. Some worked, many didn't. They tried ramming attacks, where German pilots would deliberately collide with B-17s, hoping to destroy the bomber while bailing out themselves. Some pilots succeeded. Most died. The fundamental problem was that the B-17 was simply tougher than anything the Germans had designed their weapons to fight. Their 20mm cannon shells were designed to destroy lightly built fighters and medium bombers. Against the heavily built B-17, those shells did damage, but not enough damage fast enough. By 1944, with the introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the dynamics of the air war shifted completely. B-17s no longer flew unescorted deep into Germany. American fighters could now accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back, and Luftwaffe fighters had to fight through the escorts before they could even reach the bombers. The loss rate for bomber crews dropped from 5% per mission to 2%. The odds of surviving a 25-mission tour went from 30% to over 60%. Men had a better than even chance of going home. The human cost of the air war remained staggering. The 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men killed in action during the war, more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in the Pacific. But the B-17's survivability saved thousands of lives. Crews in damaged bombers that made it back to England, crews that would have died in less robust aircraft, survived because Boeing's engineers had built in redundancy and structural strength. Robert Rosenthal flew 52 combat missions, double the required tour, and survived the war. He returned to Brooklyn, practiced law, and never spoke publicly about his experiences until the 1980s. When asked about the February 27th mission, his response was simple. "The B-17 saved our lives," he said. "We should have died a dozen times that day. The aircraft was shot to pieces, but it flew us home. I don't know how, but it did." Michael Arcangelo, his co-pilot, had a more technical explanation. "Boeing built the B-17 to be survivable," he said in a 1990 interview. "Every structural member was stronger than it needed to be. Every system had a backup. It was like they anticipated that we'd get shot up and designed the aircraft to keep flying anyway. And they were right." Franz Stigler, the German pilot who escorted Rosenthal's bomber to safety, survived the war and emigrated to Canada. In 1990, he and Rosenthal finally met at a veterans reunion. The two men, former enemies, became close friends. Stigler explained why he hadn't shot down the damaged bomber. "It was no longer a war machine," he said. "It was just men trying to survive. I couldn't kill men who were already beaten." Rosenthal's response captured the essence of the B-17's legend. "We weren't beaten," he said. "As long as that bomber was in the air, we were still in the fight. The B-17 never quit. And because it didn't quit, we didn't quit." The production numbers tell the story of America's industrial commitment to the daylight bombing campaign. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed built 12,731 B-17s during the war. At peak production, Boeing's Seattle plant was completing one bomber every 90 minutes. The Germans, by comparison, built approximately 6,000 heavy bombers of all types during the entire war. The industrial gap wasn't just about numbers, it was about philosophy. American bombers were designed for survivability and mass production. German aircraft were designed for performance and individual craftsmanship. In a war of attrition, mass production, and survivability, won. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy. They fly at air shows, and veterans sometimes attend to see the aircraft that carried them through the war. The sound of four Wright R-1820 radial engines is unmistakable, a deep, throaty roar that carries for miles. The legacy of the B-17 extends beyond its combat record. The design philosophy, building structural redundancy and multiple backup systems into aircraft, became standard practice in aviation. Modern commercial airliners are direct descendants of the B-17's design principles. Redundant systems, structural strength beyond minimum requirements, and survivability in the face of catastrophic failures are all traced back to lessons learned from bombers that absorbed incredible damage and brought their crews home. The Luftwaffe pilots who called the B-17 a flying coffin learned a hard lesson. The coffin wasn't for the American crews. It was for the myth of German air superiority. Every B-17 that limped back to England with catastrophic damage was proof that American engineering and industrial capacity could overcome German tactical skill. The strategic bombing campaign, despite its enormous cost in lives and aircraft, succeeded in destroying Germany's ability to wage war. Factories were bombed, oil refineries were destroyed, transportation networks were shattered. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend German airspace against daily raids of hundreds of bombers, was bled white. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and Germany's war industry was crippled. The B-17 had done its job. It had absorbed everything Germany could throw at it and kept flying. In the final accounting, the flying fortress wasn't a coffin. It was a shield, a metal shell that protected the men inside through the worst hell that industrial warfare could create. The Luftwaffe had laughed at the name. The B-17 had the last laugh. It always did.